Okay, yeah. Many thanks for this introduction, Paula. I'm happy to be here and see so many familiar faces. This is already the third colloquium for me. So, yep. Cuernavaca, Durango, and now here. Okay, so I'm gonna close this door because I'm getting a lot of voice. Okay. So this talk today will be a little bit of a critical self-reflection, and I'm not gonna have any full answers, but I think that I'm at least seeing the bigger problem of normativity in cognitive science, and my aim will be to just try to, make you share in the mystery if I can, right? So that we can all think a little bit more deeply about how do we fit normativity, not just in cognitive science, but if we can't fit it in cognitive science, then how can we fit it in the rest of the world, right? So this is really something that has very, very broad ramifications. So in cognitive science, there has been a lot of discussion of radical enactivism proposed by Hotte and Mayen, and they have this idea of the which they basically use to argue against people who have a representational view of mind. And this is just one slide on this. The rest of the talk I will actually be criticizing enactivism, not representationalism, but this is just to give you an idea of the kind of argument that they're putting forward. They say that appealing to representational content is deeply problematic because of the problems faced by attempts to naturalize content in the strict sense of naturalism. And I know there are proposals to do that, but according to them, they're all lacking. And even if we then say, let's relax naturalism, right, and say that we can talk about the origins of content in terms of social cultural practices, for example, well, then that would mean that there's no content in what they call basic mind. So basically all the creatures who don't have those kind of social cultural practices. But let's just assume for a moment that we can naturalize content, right? So something like the firing patterns in my brain represent my experience of being here in this room, something like that. Then we can ask us the question, what kind of role does that content play in the activity of the brain, right? What kind of causal work does it do, right? Because it seems like it's just an extra gloss that we can do without. Saying that these neurons are firing because I see the red on his jumper, right? Well, what if we say that those neurons don't have any content of redness, they're just firing, that they have no content? Would that make any difference for me right now? How would I know that that's the difference, right? So it seems at the causal level, content doesn't play any role, even if we knew how to explain its origins, right? So the vehicles seem to be the crucial part here, not the content. Anyway, we can go into this in the discussion if you want. I just wanted to say that this is what they argue against the representationalists. But also in the embodied side of the cognitive sciences, we have similar issues, and that's going to be the focus of this talk. So here we have Stuart Kauffman, and for him, semantics goes all the way back to the origins of life. He says, once there's an autonomous agent, there's semantics from its privileged point of view. The incoming molecule is yuck or yum, right? So either it's food for you or it's poisonous. I think that from the autonomous agent's perspective, yuck or yum is primary, unavoidable, and of the deepest importance to that agent, right? So I highlight this because this is where the explanatory role is supposed to come in, right? Deep importance for the agent. So it's supposed to make a difference for the agent somehow. It's not just an extra epiphenomenal gloss on more basic mechanisms. He says, without attributing consciousness to an E. coli, I cannot help but feel that the rudiments of value are present once autonomous agents are around. So how does he explain this? How is it possible for normativity to make a difference, to make a deep importance to the agent? Well, he actually goes straight off the deep end and says we need to look into quantum mechanics, right? He says if there's a tendency of co-evolving autonomous agents to increase the diversity of alternative events, right? So basically, I could have done something else if I had wanted to, for example, that occur, then living entities must eventually hit the Heisenberg uncertainty limit and abide at least partially in the quantum realm. Organisms do touch the Heisenberg uncertainty limit all over the place in the subtle distinctions that we make, turning genes on and off, smell sensors on and off, eyes on and off this way and that. So you can see that it's a big problem, right? I mean, he wants to talk about value, but the only way he can think of doing it is to go into the quantum realm. Now, in the kind of autopoietic enactive tradition, normativity is also one of the essential concepts. It's part of the definition of what it means to be an agent. Right? It's an agent is an autonomous organization capable of adaptively regulating and coupling with the environment according to the norms established by its own viability conditions. And then one way of visualizing is that to have this diagram where you have your region of viability and there's a trajectory in there, and if you exit the viability run, well, you're dead. Right? So adaptivity keeps you within the zone. But yet again, if you look at how people are trying to understand what's going on here, they choose purely dynamical systems models. They just have states with equations that describe how those states change over time. Now the question is, where's the normativity in that? That's just happenings, right? That's just equations unfolding. There's no normativity here, no good and bad, right? No value, right? So it seems to me that across the board, and it goes to representationalists and inactivists and embodied cognition people, we need to get a grip on normativity, right? I think what we want to say, right, minimally, is that an activity is more than mere movement, right? Or that just physical movement is less than activity, right? It lacks or misses something. You can invert this somehow. An activity is someone's doing, right? So you're listening to me right now, rather than just mere happening, like the Earth moving around the sun in space while we're sitting here, right? An activity is done for achieving something, a purpose, a goal, realizing a desire, an intention, etc. Therefore, an activity is normative because it can succeed or fail with respect to some evaluative criteria, right? So that applies with you listening to me. It doesn't apply to the Earth moving around or the moon moving around, right? If they stop moving, that's not a failure of the Earth, right? That's just something that happens. So does normativity make a difference, right? Or to say differently, does the difference between an activity and a movement make a difference? We can make this distinction like I did in the previous slide, but what's the consequence of making that distinction, right? I suspect that all of us want to say that normativity does make a difference, right? It plays a role of some kind. I also suspect that the way in which it plays a role will be different for us, right? So we'll have different opinions on which way normativity plays a role. So one take-home message here is that I just want to carve up the space of possible roles of normativity, and then we can see how we can move between them or situate within them. So I would say overall, yes, normativity matters, but how much does it matter? I think that's where the debate is at the moment. Like, is it just weakly important, moderately so, or does it matter a lot? So that's a strong yes, you know, and that's a crazy yes that I'm starting to play with, but that, you know, it's almost like career suicide to take seriously. And we will have a look at that in a moment. The most safest bet for any scientist is the weak yes. You can say, yes, normativity matters, but only in the sense that it provides a heuristic, higher-level description of physical processes. The normative description of the agent will only make a difference until we have a complete physical account. That's kind of almost like standard textbook philosophy of science, right? In this case, normativity is only intrinsically attributed to the agent. It's something that we describe, but that has no other relevance, right? And the goal of science from this point of view is to actually give us the real story, the real physical account that then allows us to replace this heuristic description. Pros and cons of the weak yes to normativity. Well, the key advantage is that we don't have the problem of naturalizing anything, right? It doesn't even exist. It's just an illusion that it exists. A key disadvantage is that it's an unstable position because the argument that normative claims should be replaced by physical descriptions is itself normative, right? It's something that we should do or aspire to. And phenomenologically, it sits uncomfortable with how we experience ourselves in daily lives, right? That we do act normatively and for reasons, and that makes a difference to us. So then, perhaps, I don't know if anybody, you know, is in favor of the weak yes. Probably nowadays it's not such a fashionable position anymore. So that brings us then to the moderate yes. Normativity matters, but only moderately so. It matters because it provides an additional higher level description of the physical processes that tells us something about the agent. Yet a complete physical description of the causes of an agent is in principle still possible. Right? So the status here is that the normativity, it can be either extrinsic or intrinsic of the agent, and the goal of science should be to try to identify the kinds of systems that lend themselves to be described in normatively or normative terms. Right? So we want to have it both ways. Pros and cons, the key advantage is that it acknowledges the importance of normativity, right? So it says it's not something to be eradicated. That's already something, right? So there's something that's useful. But it doesn't really go beyond that. It doesn't give it a special role, right? In that sense, it still sits uncomfortably with the fact that in addition to making use of normative descriptions to talk about things, we also experience ourselves as acting because of normativity, right? I do something for a reason, and we want that reason to make a difference. And even though it's slightly more in tune with our phonology, it still has to face a mind-body gap, right? So why is it that some processes for which we have a purely physical explanation, we also at the same time can give a normative explanation, right? So here, my guess is that maybe the best bet is to actually just go mind-body identity and say, it just is the case that some physical processes are also normative processes. And that's it, end of the story. We don't give any additional explanation of why that is so. And that still sits uneasy with the phonology, because it would mean that in effect, there's an overdetermination of our actions, right? We say that we act for reasons, but really that reason doesn't do any extra causal work. It would be completely also caused if it was a complete philosophical zombie. So that's also weird, right? So now let's go to the crazy option. Strong yes to normativity. On this view, normativity matters because the normative description tells us something essential about the nature of the agent that acts, and a complete physical description of the causes of an action is in principle impossible. And this is the key difference to the previous one. Why is the physical description impossible? Because if it was possible, there would be no room left for something to be caused by a reason, right? To be caused for values, to be caused because something matters to you. On this view, the status must be that normativity is an intrinsic property and not just merely ascribed from the outside. And the goal for cognitive science from this point of view would be to understand how physical descriptions could be incomplete and how normative ones could complement them or complete them. Right? So then now we have to try to look for an interface. We have to look for holes in the physical story, which we can then fill with a normative story. The pros and cons of the strong yes. The key advantage is that it is fully consistent with our phonology that we do things for a reason, and that this makes a genuine difference for how we move. I think for me that's like the key aspect here. It makes a genuine difference for how we move, whether we want to do something, believe in something, what emotions we're feeling at the time. Do we have values associated with it, right? Basically, if you agree that we're not philosophical zombies, and that not being philosophical zombies makes a difference for how we move, then you have to go somewhere in this direction. It's a bit strange, but if you assume that a complete description of the universe would be possible in principle, that means there's no room for normativity to do any actual causal work. All right, but this point of view, this strong yes, faces the double challenge of having to address the mind-body gap. So we still have this problem of how do we relate physical processes and mental processes and normative processes? And additionally, we would have to demonstrate how the normative can make a difference in the physical. Right? That's going back to like Descartes' substance dualism and having some kind of thing in your brain that connects to consciousness in another realm, right? Well, maybe Descartes is not so far removed from this, right? And I'm personally very uneasy to go there, but I can see at least the motivation for having that kind of view, right? The problem here is that as scientists, this kind of point of view sits very uneasily with most versions of naturalism. Cause events to happen that are underdetermined by the physical history of the universe, right? So basically, what I wanted to say, what I'm now happens because I wanted it to happen in the entire history of the universe, physically, right? Because if it did, then basically it requires us to say that the universe is non-deterministic. At least that much we need to acknowledge in order to not physical can play a role, right? So one way of visualizing an event, so remember the diagram I had about like the viability zone and there's a trajectory, right? So one way of visualizing such a normative event would be a moment in which the trajectory of an agent's physical state veers of its otherwise physically determined path. So imagine that we had a complete knowledge of the entire history of the universe, which would make a prediction about how is my hand going to move in the next moment, but suddenly it moves differently. Okay, that's the kind of thing that we would need to look for to say, this would mean assuming that the universe is non-deterministic and that its physical description will always be in, which is, most of the time that includes me, the causal closure of the universe as a deterministic for something else to intervene. It's very hard to give up foundation of the scientific worldview. And yet, we find that we may have to and in a longer version of this talk, I had many slides now trying to share this intuition that I have with you. I'm just going to now appeal to authority of Rodney Brooks, who is like the founder of embodied cognition, embodied robotics, was a big name in artificial life. And towards the end of his career, he wrote this little opinion paper, and another version came out in Nature a few years later, where he says, perhaps we have all missed some organizing principle of biological systems or some general truth about them. He's basically saying, why can we not create complete lifelike systems? We can approximate it, but somehow there seems to be always something missing. He says, perhaps there's a way of looking at biological systems which will illuminate an inherent necessity in some aspect of the interactions of their parts that is completely missing from artificial systems. I'm suggesting that perhaps at this point we simply do not get it, right? And for someone who spent his entire career trying to create insect-like robots, at the end of career, the robotic principles recreate behavior. One interesting proposal that came out in recent years that I will briefly touch on now is that maybe it's this missingness, the lack itself, which we should take seriously as the clue of what differentiates the kind of systems that Brooks was working with from living systems. Right, so here's Deacon, who wrote a book called Incomplete Nature, How Mind Emerged from Matter. He says, each of these sorts of phenomena, a function, reference, purpose, or value, is in some way incomplete. There's something not there. Without this something missing, they would just be plain and simple physical objects or events. Right? This goes back to the beginning of the talk. What's the difference between something doing something and something just happening? Right? You could say the happening is missing something that's going on when we're doing something. This paradoxical intrinsic quality of existing with respect to something missing is irrelevant when it comes to inanimate things, but it is a defining property of life and mind. It seems that we must explain the uncaused appearance of phenomena whose causal powers derive from something non-existent. Right? Wow, crazy stuff, right? It's really hard to get a grip on what that could even mean, right? But like I said, if you want to take seriously the notion that normative aspects themselves, by themselves, as such, can make a difference to the unfolding of material processes, you basically have to accept that they're not determined by other previous physical events, because otherwise you don't leave them any room for their own causal powers to unfold. Right? So in some sense, Deacon is agreeing with this analysis. But is it true? Is the physical world non-determined and incomplete? You know, every time I meet a theoretical physicist, I ask them this question, and it seems like there's no consensus on this. But here's an influential paper by the mathematician Conway and the quantum physicist Cochin. They joined up to publish a paper in which they set out a mathematical proof showing that the universe is non-deterministic. Okay, they say, our theorem asserts that if experimenters have a certain freedom, then particles have exactly the same kind of freedom. So they're talking about human freedom in the sense that we have a choice in how to measure things, right? Should I measure position first, velocity, and depending on which order we choose, it makes a difference to the outcome of the experiment. That's what they have in mind here when they talk about the experimenter freedom. Indeed, it is natural to suppose that this latter freedom is the ultimate explanation of our own, right? And adding randomness also does not explain the quantum mechanical effects. And this is a very interesting, footnote, because usually, as soon as someone says, "Oh, when you say that what I'm doing now is not determined, then you must be saying it's random." Right? It seems like that's the opposite pair. Now, that's not true. There are two options. It could be random, or it could be non-determined. And the two are not the same because it's something that is random can still be determined, right? You just pick the random number seed in your computer generator program, and then you run it, and then all the numbers it generates will be random, but actually, you know, as long as you know the algorithm and the starting seed, you can calculate all of them deterministically, right? So it's not the same to say that something is random to say that something is non-deterministic. For them, the import of the free will theorem is that it is not only current quantum theory, but the world itself, it's not only current quantum theory, but the world itself that is non-deterministic, so that no future theory can return us to a clockwork universe, right? So at least at the level of quantum physics, it's true. But if it's true there, then maybe that opens a little theoretical gap for us to think about non-determinism more broadly. That's how I take it. You know, we can take issue with many other parts of their work. I don't think it's as easy to say that a particle has freedom, so therefore we have freedom. I mean, that doesn't work. But as long as they say, you know, there's nothing problematic with a non-deterministic universe, that's already for me a step in the right kind of direction. And now to go the last couple of slides, how could we imagine scaling up from something like a very microscopic, you know, quantum event to something that actually is more relevant to us, an activity? So Hans Jonas, who has been a big influence on enactivism, actually has this very nice little book called Power or, well, Lack of Power of Subjectivity, for better words right now. And in this book, he was making contact for the first time with things like systems theory, chaos theory, quantum theory. And basically his idea is that if we have an unstable system, right, so we can imagine that it's something like, I want to balance this bottle on the edge here, right? Okay, maybe ideally there is one configuration where it would stay like that, but every perturbation, no matter how small, would make it fall over to the side, right? So it's an inverted cone. But how it falls over, we can't really predict because the fluctuations will be so small, we can't really know. In fact, we can imagine that they're infinitely small, so small that they would be immeasurable. If that's the case, then we have an immeasurable physical effect leading to a macroscopic effect, namely there's a shift, right? It falls over one or the other side, therefore giving us a kind of pseudo-mechanism for going through something that is not physical or not physically describable or not physically measurable to something that is. And for him, this was the kind of like, you know, mind-body relationship solution, that basically you have lots of possibilities. I can move my arm up, down, sideways, whatever, that I have at the same time. And the way in which it translates into an actual physical reality where we only have one of these options is precisely by looking at the brain in a critical state where just the tiniest perturbation that is physically immeasurable will push it into one macroscape or another. Okay. There are lots of open questions with this, right? Again, I mean, what does it mean to say psyche on the other side? I mean, how does that interface with pieces? Are we back to the Cartesian dualism or not? Okay, I don't know. This is just, I'm just saying, you know, thinking about the non-encounterable physical effects having a macroscopic effect, we can think of unstable equilibrium as one example. Okay. So basically, I don't know. All I can say is that if we want normativity to play a role in, for example, saying the way I'm talking right now, the way you're listening, the way we're moving, on its own, because you want it, because there's your intention to do so, we have to take something away from the physical universe. We have to create an opening on the side of the physical that allows it to be completed by the side of the subjective intentions. And that means it has to be non-deterministic physically and it has to be incomplete physically. Okay, so much I think is you know, we can already say. And how the final story works, I don't know. But just to leave this as a concluding thought, if we don't find an answer to that, it means that we're basically stuck in a clockwork universe where, although we have all this rich experience, it doesn't really make any difference to how we behave. And I think that's an unacceptable situation for us to have, and I don't think it's a very healthy message for cognitive science to be promoting in the rest of society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk. I have a clarification question. I'm not sure. At first, you presented our view, our scientific view of the universe as deterministic, and it sounded like there is consensus about the universe being deterministic. Then you presented a paper by Cohen and Conway.
Yes, they're outsiders.
Excuse me?
They're outsiders.
Outsiders.
They're not the mainstream.
So you are saying that our scientific view is deterministic, and only a few scientists are against this. But
correct.
But it seems to me that after quantum mechanics, the probabilistic view of the universe is mainstream and not the deterministic view of the universe. So
the 2 points there. First, if it was just probabilistic, it would still not be enough for the purposes that I have in mind. Precisely because I said, if our only option is to choose between determinism and randomness, there's still no real room here for intentional activity.
Well, I don't know if we understand probabilistic in the same sense. Probabilistic would mean that there are, as you said at the end of the talk, several probabilities, several events that are probable with different probabilities. Yeah?
Yep.
So, but not infinite, maybe some number.
Okay.
So the fact is that there is no possibility of predicting with just physics that one of these events will be the one that will be actual. Mm-hmm. So you have this opening there with a probabilistic universe.
Yes, I think that's quite common.
Where mind, for example, emergent conception of mind could make the difference. So some probabilities would be excluded from the universe, and one would be actualized because of subjectivity or mind or whatever. So I don't know if that fits into.
So that's true. So there are some subtle, aspects of the argument by Conway and Cohen that say that this kind of traditional interpretation of quantum mechanics is not enough to prove a non-deterministic account. For them, it's still possible that basically what we're seeing in quantum physics is a completely deterministic universe that basically, since, let's say, the Big Bang forward, it's just running through some equations. And the randomness is basically just because at the very beginning, for example, there was a random number generator that generated millions of random numbers, which are being read, one by one. Every time there's a quantum collapse, it just takes a random number from that set. And that's enough to replicate the results without allowing any opening for non-determinism. So in order to avoid that, they have to make some weird mental gymnastics related with a certain kind of measuring where that's not possible, because the way in which you measure it, you're constraining the system on the fly, and there's no way in advance to know which way you're going to measure next or something like that. But that's the only way to prevent this possibility that actually, although they look random to us, those random events have also been predetermined from the start of the universe.
So I want to understand what you mean by normativity a little better. So I have a reason to drink a beer. Beer is sitting in front of me. Now, seems to me, it's not clear to me why non-determinism helps explain my having a reason and my acting on the reason, since absent some external intervening factor or my keeling over dead, I'm going to pick up the beer and drink it. So I just don't quite see how you get from, there's this puzzle, there's this mystery about how there can be normativity in the world, to, okay, the way to solve the puzzle is to have non-determinate events in the world.
Physical events, right?
Physical.
Yeah, so your mental events are totally, I want your mental reason for wanting a beer to play a role as such, as being a mental wish on your part. And in order to allow that, I have to at the same time, you want to clarify? at the same time, not allow the possibility that if I completely eradicated your mental part, your actions, or let's say your movements in that case, would be exactly the same. That means even if you didn't have any subjectivity and you were just a mindless zombie, you would still reach for the beer and drink it. If that is possible, that basically then means that your personal level experience of doing it because you wanted a beer plays no role in the actual physical processes. In that sense, they're causally impotent.
So is your view that somebody could be causal, sort of physically identical to me and not have reasons to drink the beer?
If I was assuming that the universe was causally complete, yes.
So then
I'm not. Right?
You're a dualist then, right?
Well, that's the question, right? That's why I was thinking. My whole career I have not been a dualist, right? So I mean, this is almost like a self-confession session or something like that. No, the way in which I want to try to make it work is not by adding something extra. To some extent, that's the representational strategy, right? Saying normativity makes a difference because we have these things called representations, and they're like, you know, realized in the neural activity and things like that. Now, for me, that doesn't work for different reasons. We can go into that as well. Maybe the alternative is not to just to say that there are no representations and the physical story stays the same. No, we have to take something away from the physical story and assume that actually there are these, let's say, incompleteness and gaps there, and then allow, for example, psychological processes to complement them. Now, then the question is, what's the metaphysical nature of the psychological process compared to the physical processes? But if you're just saying, okay, let's relax naturalism and say, even if something is not just physics, but could, for example, be psychological, that's still part of nature according to our definition, then maybe that's not dualism, right? It just depends a little bit then how we think about what kind of processes are we talking about here. And Descartes' dualism has a lot of problems, so we don't really want to go there. But the other options also don't seem so attractive to me. So that's why I'm saying I don't have the answer, but at least I think to move forward, we have to kind of problematize a little bit what's going on here. And for Hans Jonas, he said, basically when it comes to these probabilistic events, let's talk about that again, we have two options. Either we just make the physicists happy and say, okay, you know, it's just because we don't understand well enough, or there's some physical process, but that doesn't make us happy, right? The other option is to say that what's going on there is that there's a mental process that's somehow interfering with the physical processes. And he says, because of our own personal insight that we do things for a reason, we should favor that account to one that doesn't really explain anything and just says it's a random thing, right? And at least we don't have an explanation at the physical level in either case, no understanding, but it allows us a psychological understanding to actually play a role.
One last point.
Yeah.
An alternative is to try and make normativity less mysterious.
Yes, if that's possible.
So if you make a room by opening that gap you're talking about, does that mean that we should include basically all forms of life into this intentional or normative framework? And if so, what would prevent you from including robots into the club?
Yes, it's a good point. So at least in terms of, let's just start with the second one, which is the more easy one. At least in terms of computer simulations, what I'm trying to say here could give us an answer why it's so hard to replicate mind-like or life-like processes. Basically because a computer is a complete deterministic system, right? So why is it so hard for computers to understand stuff rather than deal with syntax or logic? Well, it's precisely because when it comes to things like value, meaning, semantics, things like that, well, if you have to break out of a complete deterministic system, computers don't give you that, right? So then robots is a bit more complicated because they're interfacing with the real world. Okay, so then maybe there are some options there to move forward. But it will be a question of how to include the incompleteness and non-determinism of the environment in the functioning of the computer. And most of the time, when that happens, we just get a blue screen, a window death, undefined, and then the computer stops working. So it's really not something that our current view of computers are built for or can deal with. Now, the first part of the question about life, I spent 2 months working with like the frontiers of origins of life, and most of the time, people there just think in terms of physics and chemistry, and now they're starting to think about geochemistry and planetary processes. What they don't think about is subjectivity. But when you come to think about what's the origins of life, and why is it such an intractable problem? Now, a few years ago in science, it was one of the top 10 unresolved problems in science. What's the origin of life? How do we explain it? And it might be the case that it's so hard to crack because it's basically the first time that normativity started playing a role in the physical processes in the universe. And so Hans Jonas, again, he has this idea that when you start talking about life, you talking about self-production, metabolism. So to some extent, by being far from equilibrium systems, which have to do work and spend energy by maintaining themselves, otherwise they would just drift equilibrium, which would be thermodynamic death, basically. The fact that they're doing that is some kind of implicit value judgment, that it's better to stay away from the equilibrium than to let yourself drift to death, right? No, life somehow seems to strive, despite the energy and effort it costs, to maintain itself in the living state rather than do the natural thing, which would be the natural thing for all other physical systems, which would be to go towards the equilibrium, right? So how do we explain that? Again, I don't know, but it's one of those things where we could talk about value, such that life as such values itself, and that's why it continues itself and maintains itself and invests energy and so on. And if that's true, which again is a big statement, right? But if that's true, then doing a purely chemical account of its origins will not do, right? Because it's precisely what I said here, that once you talk about normativity in that sense, you need to have then the purely physical story will be incomplete, basically. And maybe that's exactly what we're seeing in that field. Maybe the origins of life is such a hard problem because the chemical physical story that we're telling to try to get there is intrinsically incomplete.
Thank you for your very interesting talk. I have a doubt. I cannot imagine what could be the truth conditions of theory that I'm trying to explain a non-deterministic universe. Which could be the truth conditions of that kind of theories?
The truth condition of that kind of theory?
How
well, basically I would have to refer you to read the Conway and Cochrane paper.
How to validate the statement that affirms something about a non-deterministic universe?
Basically, in their paper, they have to show that what the system does couldn't be predicted even if we had complete knowledge of the entire history of the physical universe. And they do it through some weird quantum entanglement kind of thought experiment, that if you had some device here and some device somewhere else, and then you did some measurements here, and you kind of like, change the order of your measurements, then the other system would have to somehow correspond with your measurements in a way that couldn't be predicted ahead of time, something like that. But to be honest, I'm not a quantum physicist, so for me it's a bit hard to grasp the details of their experiment.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this event for inviting me. Then I want to apologize because I'm going to break one basic rule of academic reciprocity, because I usually like to be for the whole colloquium. I would have loved to be here for the whole colloquium to listen to all of you guys, but unfortunately, when I accepted to be here, my life was much more easier than right now, because lately I got a job at the university's administration, so I have more bureaucratic work than ever before, so that's a big problem for me right now. And third, I'm a sociologist. I am not a philosopher or psychologist, and I think that maybe these things that I'm going to talk about are going to be a little bit strange in a certain way, but they have to do with morals, so, well, that's the main point. And last but not least, I'm very sorry, but I am not used to do presentations in PowerPoint, so this is the best I was able to do, so, well, thank God. Okay, well, I'm going to talk about morality, contingency, and and particularly from the point of view of a theory that I've been developing for the last 10 years, that is the theory of the social reduction of contingency. But before I go there, I want to tell you something about the sociology of moral. Well, morality has been very important for sociology for a very long time. Since the early stages of sociology, we've been dealing with morality. Particularly, Emile Durkheim was a very, very important grounding father for sociology who wrote a lot about morality. For Durkheim, society was a moral milieu. And he understood morality or moral facts as something that consisted of duty and desirability. Yeah? Just like Marx, I mean, Marx, we all know Marx because he was this great thinker about social classes, but he never wrote a book or anything about social classes because he died. Well, he wrote about social classes, but he never wrote the big thing that we would have expected from him. It was the same thing with Durkheim. Durkheim never wrote his book on morality or moral, but he gave us lots of interesting ideas to understand this phenomenon from a sociological point of view. After Durkheim, many other sociologists were thinking about morals, but after the 1950s, sociology of morality was kind of an old-fashioned thing to do. So sociology was more aware of other phenomena such as power or inequality. And morality, sociology of morality was kind of a conservative thing to do. But nowadays, thanks to the work amongst others of Gabriela Bent, sociology of morality is back on track. And there are some very interesting developments in that area right now. What I'm going to talk about is in particular from this point of view of the theory of the social reduction of contingency. I'm going to tell you something about this theory. Well, first of all, it is, as I was telling you, it's a theory I have been developing for the last 10 years. It is an effort to find a way to integrate different ideas that are nowadays important in sociology, but that are not connected. For this theory, society is not an object. I mean, for us sociologists, we always want to think society as something, society as an object, as something that consists of something in particular, social action or symbols or something. But for this theory, society is not an object, but a reference problem. A reference problem that has to do with contingency. This idea of contingency, and particularly of double contingency, is something that is very old in sociology as well. We can go back in time to the work of Talcott Parsons in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. And the idea is that in the social world, an event, something, is neither necessary nor impossible. Things can happen, but they are not bound to happen. They can happen. And for example, for Parsons, the way to reduce contingency was through socialization. And the socialization of values, for example. But after the 1960s, with all the social movements and everything that was going on back then, people were not very happy with this answer by Parsons, and they started to think about power and many other things. But nowadays, we have a much more abstract way to look at these kind of things. And in this theory of social reduction of contingency, what I am proposing is that that this mutual uncertainty regarding what the other person will do, this kind of complexity, can be reduced by three main social contingency reducing operators that are communication, practical disposition and capacities, and materiality. So this idea of reduction of contingency through communication, dispositions, and materiality is what I'm going to develop related to morality right now. First, communication. This has a lot to do with the work of a German sociologist called Niklas Luhmann, but well, it has some differences as well. First of all, if we want to understand morality from a sociological point of view, we have to understand that morality is first and foremost a system, as a communication. Communication is, for us, for sociologists, morality has nothing, well, it has to do with other things, but mainly it is communication. Morality is not a system. For example, there is not a system of morality, like we would say there is a system of science or economics or politics. Morality is a form of communication that circulates throughout society. It cannot be differentiated because there is no system that communicates only in moral terms. For us, morality has a particular code. That is the code, the basic form of this code is good, bad, but there is a much more developed form of this code, that is the code respect, contempt. And morality, in modern society, morality has a particular function that has to do with, that is limited, first of all, that is limited because in modern society, what we have is that we have different systems that operate and that fulfill different functions. And these functions cannot be fulfilled by morality right now. For example, science has to do with the development of new knowledge. Economics has to do with the management of scarcity. Law has to do with some sort of fixation of normative expectations. Morality, in this regard, as I was telling before, cannot be differentiated. There is no system that only communicates in moral terms. So what we have here is that morality right now can only be a way to observe the operation of these other systems in order to irritate this communication. No? For example, when we say this politician is doing something wrong, something bad, this communication can irritate the communication of the political system, but it cannot determine it. So for us, morality cannot determine what the operations in modern society. It is just a way to communicate, a way to observe. It is a frame to observe things, and it is a frame to understand certain things, but it is very limited in what it can achieve, because we cannot get things with morality. For example, if I want to buy something, I cannot go on there and say, oh, okay, I'm good, give me something. If I want to find the truth about something, I cannot go and say, okay, I am a good person, I am entitled to know something. Yeah? These communications are very differentiated, and these communications have different functions, and morality is only one way of communication. But it is an important communication, nonetheless, because it can, as I was telling you, it can irritate other systems. It can irritate not only these big systems, such as science, politics, law, etc., but it can irritate our interactions. Our interactions. For example, we can always criticize somebody because somebody for the things he's been doing or something like that, and it can as well irritate the communication of organizations. So this is the very first idea that I wanted to present here. Morality as communication is a way to reduce contingency in a certain way, because at least it gives us the capacity to build certain structures for action. Yeah? That is, that we can in a certain way, in a certain way, that thanks to morality, we feel that we are entitled to expect something, and that is important in society. But this is not the only thing that sociology can say about morality nowadays. The second point has to do with these practical dispositions and capacities. Here, what is important to say is that obviously morality needs a human being that is able to act in a moral way. And that is not something that we sociologists think that has to do with some sort of reason that is like an a priori thing, you know, but that is the outcome of socialization. For example, the fact that we are all here, sitting here, listening to these crazy ideas about morality and sociology, and that we are behaving in a certain way, you know, that we are all listening, paying attention, or at least pretending to be paying attention and stuff like that, it's not something that we were born with. And it is not something that humanity has always known. It is the outcome of a process of civilization. It is the outcome of a process of socialization. In this, that is an idea that was developed by a German sociologist called Norbert Elias. It is the same thing with morality. To act in a moral way, we need to be educated by society. We need to develop certain dispositions. That is, we need to develop a certain ways to act under certain circumstances and certain capacities. Capacities, for example, to understand the difference between good and bad in a certain society. I know that philosophically speaking, this is kind of problematic because there is the idea that morality has to do with some sort of universal thing, but obviously for us sociologists that is a very different pill to swallow because we don't really find lots of universals in societies. I know that there are some points to discuss here, but well, I'm going to move forward. So morality has to do with communication, and morality has to do with the body. With the body, with socialization, with a certain capacity to act morally, something that we have to learn throughout our lives. In this regard, we sociologists in general, we don't think that there is some sort of potential that can be reached by human being, some sort of that we can become better or more perfect or more human. No, we just think that this society builds or constructs our dispositions and gets us ready to act under certain circumstances. And the third point, this thing with morality and technology, or materiality and technology. Not only philosophers, but as well sociologists, sometimes we live or we think of the world as if the world was just kind of a symbolic world. Sometimes we forget things, we forget materiality. And with morality, we tend to forget it even more. What I want to say here, and I am using here many of the ideas developed by French sociologist Bruno Latour, but amongst others, obviously, is that as well, morality has to do with things, that our material world is something that helps us to behave in a moral way. For example, and this is an example that I am using from Latour. For example, when we are driving our car, and we pass a school or we approach a school, always we have to slow down a little bit. But sometimes we do not, and especially, I mean, here in Mexico, we all know that is something that has to do with practical dispositions. We don't have always these practical dispositions developed. So we see the shield, we see, okay, there's a school, I don't care. I'm going to go as fast as I can, no matter what. But there is a speed bump. And this speed bump makes me slow down the car. I have to slow. I have to go slower. I have to step on the brakes of the car. And that, I mean, that is the morality of things, because we don't want to behave in a moral way there. We don't want to be good citizens. We don't want to be good persons. We don't care about the children. We don't care about the future of the world, whatever. But we have to do what the thing is telling us to do. And that is the same thing with security belts in cars. But even, I was experiencing this like a couple of minutes ago when I was coming here with my phone. I was using Waze, and I was in an Uber car. And when I wanted to ask Waze which way to take, Waze told me, if you are driving, you are not supposed to give me information. Okay, if you're driving, don't behave in a bad way. If you're driving, don't use me. I told Waze, I am not driving. I am a passenger, and Waze told me, it's okay. You can proceed and find the way to where you are going. So this is a very interesting thing, because for us in sociology, and I'm speaking here for the whole sociological community, and that is a kind of a stupid thing to do, but well, just to make this in a more dramatic way, for us, morality has to do with these three things: communication, dispositions and capacities, bodily dispositions and capacities, and materiality. And in these three ways, morality is a way to reduce the contingency of our social encounters, of our social relationships. I know that this is kind of far away from what I've just heard about the laws of the natural physical world, but I think that it is nonetheless interesting to locate and to think about it, because it can give us a certain idea of what a social approach to morality is, and as well it can help us sociologists to communicate with other scientific communities, because many times we feel that you guys are talking about society way too much, and you are never inviting us to participate in your colloquiums. So thank you very much.
Okay, we have 10 minutes for questions.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that talk. Simple question. So when it comes to morality, you talk about communications, practical dispositions, materiality. There's also norms governing conventions and food and dress and all these things, which philosophers typically, although not everybody in this room, would distinguish. They'd say, look, there's moral norms and then there's other kinds of norms. But it sounds like, prima facie, and maybe I'm just inviting you to tell me whether this is right, that there's no significant difference from your perspective between what we typically think of as moral norms and other sorts of norms.
Okay, well, actually, in my perspective, there's a difference, because it has to do with this coding. I mean, with this good, bad, or as I was saying earlier, this respect, contempt thing. In sociology, we tend to think of norms as expectations, and expectations, there are two kinds of expectations: normative expectations and cognitive expectations. In normative expectations, we learn not to learn, because we don't have to change them every time the world is not working accordingly to our expectations. And cognitive expectations are kind of different, because if something, for example, in science, theories are kind of expectations, but if the world behaves in a different way, we have to change theory. We don't expect the world to change according to theory. And as well, just to one last little idea, there would be even a difference between moral norms and, for example, law, because law would have a different function in society, although obviously it is very intertwined with moral, but it has a different function that has to do with other things.
Thank you very much. I have a question concerning if morality is constrained by communication, practical dispositions, and materiality, and given that we are all acquiring a common ways of communication and a common practical dispositions, and in some way the same materiality, do you think this tendency is going to make a common morality in the world, or it has, or is it going to make a pluralistic morality or something like that? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I don't think that there would be like a common morality, because there are different circumstances and situations. But I do think that certain, for example, I'm going to give you an example. For example, this thing that I was talking about, technology, you know, if we accept this idea of the morality of technology, of the morality of materiality, that might become, in a certain way, a common morality or a common moral script, but I do believe that these are kind of limited in scope, because there are many other things that have to do with morality that cannot be technologically programmed. But I think that some things could actually become kind of like common, but many other things will always depend on many other variables and many other aspects of what we call culture, although I don't really like the idea of culture very much, but it is a way to simplify this what I'm trying to say. This idea of culture, religion, many other things. But there's a possibility of a common morality through technology, possible.
Well, thank you very much for your talk. I just want a clarification questions about practical disposition, because I don't know, I was thinking that disposition is very related with determinism, you know? So if you are thinking in this contingency morality, I don't know if it's some kind of contradiction there. And something related to the last question, I don't know if we are in this indeterministic, no, well, not indeterministic, but too many contingencies, you know, you need some agreements, you know? Maybe these agreements can come from these kind of practical dispositions, because we have some kind of consensus between some kind of, but what about temporality? You can, for example, think about, I don't know, I believe in God, but tomorrow I don't believe in God anymore and I believe in Buddha, and then I believe in fidelity, and then tomorrow I don't believe in fidelity. So I don't know, what is this kind of contingency through time, you know? I think there are two questions there, but thank you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, this concept of disposition, it has a long history in sociology as well. Maybe it's not the best concept, but well. And nowadays, the author that is related to this concept is Pierre Bourdieu, and he's like, well, he died like many years ago, but he's like the super sociologist in the world right now. So, and many people are thinking these positions in a very deterministic way, certainly. But I think that even Bourdieu was not thinking them that way, at least not all of the time, because one thing is this tendency to act in a certain way, but the other point here is situations, and situation changes every time. So certain situations can stop our dispositions from being activated as well. So it is not as if just to, let me give you an example. Let's say that I have a lower class habitus, as Bourdieu would say. Well, this doesn't mean that in certain situations, for example, if tropical music is played, I'm going to dance like the king of cumbia and salsa, no? But maybe in another situation, I can activate other dispositions, because we are talking about a pluralistic system of dispositions. In sociology, we have a lot of discussion about this, like if dispositions can be plural, etc., etc. But well, it is a discussion. And the second thing, time, obviously, yes, contingencies. I mean, here the point is that even if you reduce contingency, you never eliminate contingency. So every time you are again kind of like playing the game of contingency, you can imagine, or you can think that what worked yesterday is going to work today, but that's not exactly like, it is not for sure. You still have to try to do something and see if it works in many aspects of the social life. For example, let's say the PRI here, the PRI or political party, lies all the time, obviously, and it has worked, but maybe it is not going to work tomorrow. We don't know. It is something that is still contingent.
I'm wondering, the way in which you define morality as a system of communication that minimizes contingency, there are some other social norms, I don't know, traffic norms, you mentioned them, that we don't take to be moral. So what would be like the specific difference of morality and these other social norms?
First of all, this whole idea of code, the good, bad. But another very important characteristic of morality is that, in sociology, it is directed to persons. I mean, let's say this. When you evaluate the actions of a person, you evaluate the actions of that particular person or group, and that is kind of important, because it creates like it is intended to create kind of a certain evaluation of this person in terms of a specific like moral things, like in terms of this specific respect thing. Let's say, for example, if I am a scientist and I perform an experiment and this experiment fails, I am not a bad person. Maybe I am incompetent or stupid or whatever, but I am not bad. But if I cheat, for example, cheat and I publish the results of this experiment as mine when someone else performed the experiment, I am a bad person, I'm a bad scientist, and I'm not playing by the rules. So these are aspects of morality that are important here. They don't have to do with the codings of other systems. That is something that I would need to explain like better, but it is like I can be a good scientist or a good politician, but that doesn't mean that I am good in moral or terms. For example, a good politician, Trump is a good politician, but it is not a good person. Well, I am evaluating here, but we would say he's a good politician because he knows which buttons to push to to create something to win elections, but he is not a moral character. So that is, we will have to see the codes of the other systems and see how they differ from the code of moral to understand this kind of a relational framework. That would be it.
I like to go to back to the morality and materiality issue. I hate speed bumps, but we know that we live in speed bump land, right? Topelandia, no, this is Mexico, and a colleague of mine from Europe a few years ago came to visit and told me, "Hey, you guys don't know how to behave, right?" And so I was forced to admit that yes, indeed, that we were forcibly, obliged to behave, through these speed bumps. But actually, I think they're actually immoral, in two senses, speed bumps, because on the one hand, you have no option, I mean, you have to be moral if you want, by obligation, which I don't think, I mean, you're behaving forcibly, but you're not being moral, right? But not only that, is that we're also being stripped away, from our capacity to learn, I wonder, what would happen, if all of a sudden, in Mexico, all speed bumps, disappeared, it would be like, like a reservoir, just like opening, and we wouldn't know how to behave. So we're not learning, actually. We're actually being conditioned, and so that only provokes that we have more and more speed bumps ever, So what I'm saying is that speed bumps are immoral, and they're preventing from becoming moral, so they're evil in these two senses, I think.
Just here the point is that all of these are kind of devices of programming to program morality, communication, dispositions, and that exactly. Well, but for us, behavior is kind of important. But well, I understand. The point is that morality is not like here, but it can be in things as well. That's the. I understand what you're trying to say, but the point is here is even, for example, there's a little Kantian thing. Even if I don't believe in the norm, I can behave according to the norm and communicate in a certain way. And maybe what I am learning there, I'm learning to maybe to behave strategically in a certain situation, but that is not that I am a kind of a good person or whatever. So here the point is that things can be moral as well. And just one tiny idea about what people were saying about Mexicans. I wrote my PhD in Germany, and when you go there and you see that people don't have to go through turnpikes to go in the subway, turnstiles, the subway, you think, oh, these guys are so great, they behave in such a fantastic way. But then you realize that if you don't pay your ticket in Germany, maybe you don't get your PhD degree because they are observing you the whole time. I'm really, this is a real story. When I wanted my title, they told me that you have to go to the police to find out if you have a criminal record, because if you have that, you don't get your title. And I found out that not to pay the subway can be a crime. So imagine, I mean, so it is not that they are like, oh my God, they are so well behaved. So well, that's a.
Okay, I have two questions. Can I make them? Well, the first one is, if you say morality is a way of communication, what kinds of things are processes that go against this communication? I'm thinking of, there are some societies that develop some moral concerns in terms of the environment, and some other social systems are so slow to get that information. So what kind of things are against this flow of communication?
Well, basically, the point is that social systems are amoral, no? They don't have moral. I mean, science can proceed without thinking about morals, or law in a certain way, or economics, or politics. So basically, my answer in a very brutal way is that everything is against morality, actually. Morality is kind of very, it is very improbable nowadays, but somehow, because of its own form, can be attached to certain systems to observe them. But if you think very thoroughly things, it is very unlikely because, for example, if my only aim is to win an election no matter what, if my only aim is to find a certain truth or whatever, if my only aim is to become rich, I mean, morality has lots of difficulties in the modern world because it is not the center of society, but it's kind of a very peripheral perspective that can be used, but you never know when it is going to be effective. I mean, you never know when moral judgments are going to be effective to irritate systems. So that's.
And the other question is, as you may have already seen, there are lots, there's a huge boom about explanations of morality in terms of evolutionary morality. So my question is, I think these explanations sometimes tend to trivialize the way that sociality or sociology tend to explain morality. So what's your opinion about this tendency in cognitive science, for example?
Well, to me, the first thing is that we sociologists, we are the ones to blame because we are not reading more cognitive science, and cognitive science and many other disciplines have more prestige than sociology. So basically everybody's like talking about society, but they are not inviting us to participate. So that's the first thing. And second, I think this is very silly what I'm going to say because it's way much more complex than this, but I think that truth there might be kind of in the middle in a certain way. I think that there are many things about cognitive science that are very useful for sociology, that we must read more and we must understand that. But at the same time, I think that cognitive science or all these disciplines cannot give us the whole picture because sociology can bring to the table history, socialization, situations, empirical situations. And sometimes, I mean, for example, in morality, in psychology and philosophy, you guys love these mental experiments. But mental experiments are mental experiments, but the real life is out there, and we like to get our hands dirty looking at the way people actually do moral things in the world. So that I think that we can actually have a very useful conversation but mainly if we were not that afraid of other sciences and if we would participate in this conversation more often.
So we have like 10 minutes for coffee and then back for our last talk with Eric, please.
So far, including visiting Tom Vroese's group at UNAM and an excellent workshop last week. And the start of this day was also very good. I'm a philosopher of embodied cognitive science. And after the earlier talks, you will by now have an idea of what embodied cognitive science and activism mean. For me, one of the things it means is to take seriously the experiences or the phenomenology that people have when we try to understand cognition, and also to think of embodiment mainly as our bodies carrying skills with us, around us, and these skills being acquired in sociocultural practices, and as being always situated in concrete situations like this one here, for instance, where we are surrounded by all things that matter, and basically engaging with the environment and improvising to a large extent while we're acting. So indeed, the title of my talk is The Landscape of Affordances, Situating the Embodied Mind. What I try to do is to think in terms of us being situated amongst all sorts of action possibilities that the environment offers. So affordances are the action possibilities provided by the environment, and just to give an example, here's a scene from everyday life. A guy walking towards a chair and responding to the possibility that the chair offers to sit on it, like you all did, and you're seated in chairs. You've been responding to the same kind of action possibility. So affordances are simply the action possibilities provided to us by the environment. Now there's also social affordances, and social affordances are possibilities for social interaction that the environment offers. Here you see someone being responsive to a hand, and at the same time, while this person is responding to the affordance of the hand to shake, she's ignoring the possibility that the chair offers to sit on it. And what it shows is that we are at any moment responsive to the relevant affordances in the particular situation for us. So none of you had the idea to sit on this chair, even though it does offer sitting. Which basically shows how we are very much attuned to the particular situation and to the context in which we encounter these affordances. And something else is that we always engage with multiple affordances at the same time. So some of you are now drinking from your cup of coffee, while at the same time listening to me, and while at the same time also engaging with the affordance that the chair offers. So you're coordinating with multiple affordances simultaneously, just as this guy is coordinating with the affordance offered by the chair to move it, and with the ice cream he's holding, etc. So in any situation, we coordinate or engage with multiple relevant affordances. And that phenomenon I've called skilled intentionality. It's the coordination with multiple relevant affordances simultaneously. And basically, it's what we're doing all the time. At least all the time, as long as we are in our familiar environment with which we have learned to deal skillfully. And that's what I will be focusing on. So there's a distinction between affordances as the action possibilities that are available in our ecological niche, or the human form of life, and the solicitations by the relevant affordances, which are the affordances for a particular individual in a particular situation. So for me at this moment, the keyboard here is a relevant affordance, as is the mic, but for you it's not. Now, what I'm trying to develop is a new framework for embodied cognitive science, the skilled intentionality framework, that basically tries to think of us as being integrated in and coupled with an environment that offers these action possibilities. So a skilled individual is coupled to the ecological niche that basically offers many action possibilities. And we can think of this as of us as being an integrated individual environment system. Now, affordances have relevance, as I already explained, and we encounter multiple affordances. And what you see here is a sketch of a field of relevant affordances. The width of this sketch shows the action possibilities that are available and relevant to the person at the moment. It's basically related to a readiness for engaging with these action possibilities. Now in depression, you see that there's far less of these action possibilities that matter. But there's also something else, the attractiveness, which is always crucial when we are engaging in our normal situations with relevant affordances, which is the height. Basically in depression that's gone. So in depression, the affordances are still there. You can still call your friends, you can still go out for dinner, but nothing attracts anymore. The affordances that are there are not inviting or soliciting anymore. The third dimension is the depth. That's basically that we are a temporal dimension, that we are always already anticipating what comes next. For instance, in this case, you will be, if you have any questions, then you will hold them because you are already anticipating that you will be able to ask them later on. And also the things that are happening later today, say you have an important meeting tonight, that can already be now a relevant action possibility that influences the way you engage with the situation. So the second distinction is between the landscape of affordances which are available in the human ecological niche, and that is the context of the actions in which we are engaging. For instance, if we are collaborating, doing something, we are embedded in the same landscape of available affordances, like you are now all available in this local landscape of academic affordances. And the field of relevant affordances solicits a particular individual with certain abilities in a particular situation. Someone who doesn't have the skills to understand English will, for instance, in this situation, pick up different action possibilities than someone who does. Now, the engagement with affordances is something very dynamic. It's not just static objects that we're engaging with, but our environment, our world is always in flux. And to show this flux, I like to use this fragment from a movie from the 1980s in which some guys are hanging in a very macho way during their lunch break on the street in New York City, and they're basically what they call girl watching. And the reason that I show it is for the dynamics. So look at how they are watching the girls passing by. Look at their heads. So, so the girls affords watching. It's a social affordance in a sense. But this guy is only looking at them at an appropriate moment, namely when he's not directly facing them. So basically the attunement to the dynamic action possibilities is very much responsive to the normativity that Tom was talking to already. Just like it would be a mistake for you if you would be seated here. That's also an aspect of normative engagement with the affordances available. And also for that, we don't need to think it's something that comes naturally most of the time. We just improvise in ways that we are familiar with in our sociocultural practices. Now, the relevance of my research project is basically a relevance it has for this field of embodied or enactive cognitive science. It's trying to develop this skilled intentionality framework. What we try to do is basically to consider things like sitting on a chair or grasping something, which would normally be seen as a form of lower cognition, and things like designing a building or a psychiatrist treating a patient, which would typically be seen as higher cognition. We basically say, now let's see them both as forms of skilled action, and then once they are both skilled action, then we can perhaps try to understand them in the way that we understand this kind of skilled action, namely in terms of engagement with multiple affordances simultaneously, in terms of skilled intentionality. Now, what is important then is that we have an enriched notion of affordances that still is in touch with the tradition. The notion of affordances was introduced by James Gibson, and there's really good work done in the field of ecological psychology on the notion of affordances, and we want to stay in touch with that notion. And what we've been doing is trying to basically stretch the notion of affordances in a way that that's still in touch with that tradition. And affordances can be understood as relations between aspects of the environment. For instance, this is an aspect of the environment, and this entire building is an aspect of the environment. A person is an aspect of the environment. So aspects of the environment on the one hand, and abilities available in the form of life, and I'm interested in the human form of life on the other hand. Now we have, of course, many abilities in the human form of life, and we have many aspects of the social material environment. So you can imagine that this landscape of affordances around us is really very rich. Many different aspects and many different abilities and many different sociocultural practices make this richness of the human landscape of affordances. Now the environment aspect was already mentioned in James Gibson's work. He mentioned the surfaces that offer possibilities for locomotion and support, substances offer possibilities for nutrition and manufacture, objects you can manipulate them, other animals, they offer all sorts of interactions, sexual, fighting, playing, nurturing, etc. and this is an important one, other people afford the whole spectrum of social significance for human beings. Now, the whole spectrum of social significance is, of course, a huge amount of things that it offers. And that is basically the sentence that I want to explore. Now, the other aspect of the relational definition of affordances are the abilities. There's already a lot of variety in abilities, as I said. There's also all sorts of tools, and we constantly invent new tools. Think just of all the apps for your iPhone that are being invented all the time. But that's just an example. When diving equipment was invented, new worlds of affordances opened up as well. Other abilities are the abilities of experts like architects, or abilities of surgeons or psychiatrists, as I already mentioned. All sorts of expertise contribute to it. Then there is language skills. We also, in a human form of life, we have all sorts of abilities for using language. Yes, Wittgenstein have been describing the variety of them, describing the variety of them. Now, what is important is that the reach of skilled intentionality framework, as we are developing it, is not limited to non-propositional actions, because skilled intentionality is characterized by the selective and skillful responsiveness to this rich landscape of affordances. And that includes, for instance, possibilities for making explicit judgment with propositional content. For instance, the explicit judgment and the correct possibility for judging that this curtain is brown. Okay, so that affords correctly judging that it's brown. This affords judging correctly that it's black. So that is just an aspect of the environment that we have. It's nothing special. Now, to make this further clear, a towel in the bathroom offers multiple possibilities for action. You can hang it on a hook, for instance, or you can perceive that it's really a towel. We can state correctly that's a towel. We can dry our hands. We can judge correctly that the towel is gray, and many, many more affordances. So any aspect can offer multiple affordances. To quote Wittgenstein, if I say, of course I know that's a towel, I'm making an utterance. For me, it's an immediate utterance. It's just like directly taking hold of something, as I take hold of my towel without having doubts. And yet, this direct taking hold corresponds to sureness, not to a knowing. But don't I take hold of a thing's name like that too? So the way we engage with these linguistic aspects of our environment and the affordances offered by it, it's not so special. It's nothing very different from our normal engagement with tools. I'll come back to that later. The kind of thing that we're trying to develop in this research project is to see if it would be possible to understand the entire spectrum of things that people do skillfully in terms of skilled engagement with affordances. And of course, this is a very ambitious kind of aim, and it's an exploratory project, but that is basically what we're trying to see. And the way we do it is to look at real-life situations of the way, for instance, architects are making buildings or psychiatrists treating patients. So we focus on concrete situations. And what I want to show you is one of these engagements of architects in the process of making an architectural art installation. And the way they are in reality exploring affordances. And we often use ethnographers to explore this kind of engagement with the world. Now, I should explain that I'm part and one of the co-founders of a multidisciplinary studio that operates at the borders of architecture, visual art, and philosophy. And I founded it together with my brother, Ronald Rietveld. The name is Raaf, and as you see, affordances are really central in the way we are making these art installations. Now, actually I'll skip this slide. What I want to show is a project that is titled The End of Sitting. As you can see now, when you look around, you'll notice that all of you, except for one person in the back, are being seated. And that's basically the default way we engage with our environment these days. And we were invited by the chief government architect of the Netherlands to think about the office of the future, the office of 2025, when people start to take seriously this kind of medical research that shows that a seated life doesn't last long. So for instance, if you sit 11 hours or more per day, you have 40% higher risk of dying in the next 3 years than if you sit 4 hours or less. And you can know this fact. Some of the people here in the room know this cognitively, but don't change their behavior. So in order to generate behavioral change, more needs to be done than just knowing this kind of fact. In fact, our entire society is a sitting society. We sit in the car to work, in public transport, in schools and academia, and people sit in front of their computer or laptop or TV in the evening. Now, we punish children with standing, so we teach them from young that it's not such a good idea to stand somehow. And of course, that doesn't help to change this kind of behavior. What would help is to basically build a landscape of affordances for supported standing. And that is what we did. We made a large art installation titled The End of Sitting, in which there's all sorts of action possibilities for being supported while standing and working and moving around and hanging and leaning, everything except for sitting on chairs. So this is a vision on the Office of 2025. And as you see, there's a height that it goes from lower to higher, so people can find multiple action possibilities that would support them in their working standing. And it's a landscape so that people can switch from one position to another. Again, it's important to think in terms of this individual environment system where there's a multiplicity of affordances that can support this way of engaging with the environment. Now, how did we get there? How did we make this art installation? We basically started exploring the possibilities for supported standing that you can encounter when you look around. In this way, you could work standing, or you could try out this. It's at least not sitting on a chair. People could hang in these ways. And then, while we were trying this, we found something that was really working really well. This kind of leaning back position is excellent for working standing. And then once we found it, it was basically fixated. And in this way, we collected all sorts of positions that would contribute to this big rock of standing affordances. Here you see that it makes a big difference as the feet come up. And this entire process you can call or describe the tendency towards an optimal grip. There's a term that Merleau-Ponty used in his 1945 work. The tendency towards an optimal grip is basically a phenomenon that if you, for instance, want to read something, you move to a distance where you have sufficient grip to get the text. And if you're talking to someone, you move to an appropriate distance from that person. Basically, once you start paying attention, in every situation, living beings are modifying the relationship to their environment in an attempt to decrease the level of disattunement or the lack of grip that they will have in many situations. A boxer, for instance, moves towards an optimal distance where he can do where he's ready for multiple punches. I'll come back to that later. So this entire process of developing such an art installation is basically a step-by-step trying out and exploring possibilities for improving the situation. And then there were such kind of first kind of setup, real-life models. And then once there was a model that really worked, this kind of structure, basically this provided a common ground for imagining what would be built in reality. So by having these kind of real-life models, you basically, the people in the team are basically on the same page about what will be built in the future. This position is the same as this position that was to be built later. Now, skilled collaboration in this kind of making processes is situated in places and in practices And basically, the people involved need to be ready for what the other is about to do. And by making such a scaffold, you get that kind of readiness. And of course, it helps that all of us were familiar with the place where it would be built and with the way that the bodies of the people who would come to visit the end of sitting installation function. So there's all sorts of regularities, say the size of the people, nobody would be as high as the ceiling here. That are important when you're anticipating making something. Now, language is an important aspect to it. To a large extent, things are being felt. You're feeling all the time if things are working or not working. And you could describe that phenomenon as being moved to improve. So when something is not good, you're basically trying to reposition, put it a bit steeper or less steep. And of course, you can ask people, how does it feel to be in this position? And answer you could get, it feels really good because I'm leaning back. Now, again, here language is like a tool that offers affordances. So it affordances for self-reflection. How am I feeling in this position? It affords articulation of feelings. It affords pointing out potential problems, for instance. For instance, that someone may not be able to go in front here. That was a potential problem that was pointed out, etc., etc. So the action possibilities that language, which is available in our sociocultural practice, provides are just integrated in this kind of process. Now this is the space where the installation was to be built, an art gallery in Amsterdam, Looyersgracht 60, and they gave us the space. This is the entire sculpture, the end of sitting sculpture that was made. In the space it looked like this. And basically, as I said, it's a landscape for possibilities for supported leaning, standing, hanging in all sorts of ways. After the exhibition, we made a kind of cutout of the positions that work best and shipped that in a sea container to the Chicago Architecture Biennale, where it was then again presented with people in it to basically inform people how it could be used. If you don't put people in it, then it's difficult for people to guess what they should do with it. So here you see some of the pictures we made in Chicago and the press coverage from it. But that's not so important. What is important is that researchers from the field of human movement sciences, they started exploring on this art installation how people could work standing in the future, and basically how working in this landscape that we made compares to working in a traditional open office landscape, as you would see it in many government offices nowadays, and other offices actually. So basically they were asking people how they experienced the art installation to work in. Now we see the end of sitting as a kind of fountain of youth. So people get in a bit out of shape and not very fit. They go into the end of sitting and they come out as young gods. That would be the ideal way of dealing with it. And to get there, ideally you would work 8 hours a day in the end of sitting and then not have to go to the gym anymore, for instance. And to test how many calories people burn and if they have enough exercise, the human movement scientists are now doing this kind of research where they're basically exploring which of the positions are offering this possibility of using your leg muscles really well, which is your biggest muscle group. At the same time, the landscape of affordances is explored further to basically try out new materials for future projects that could have that could be useful for other ways of living standing. Here you see one of the tests that we made with a different material, with carpet. That felt really well, and then it was basically used to make a new art installation, which is at the Dutch Mondrian Fund for the Visual Arts, and there it's really being used. It's a softer version, so it's excellent for the living room of 2025. If you don't want any chairs or couches anymore in your house, then you can have such a structure. It's very soft and offers all sorts of possibilities for supported leaning and hanging as well. Now basically I think you get the idea. So basically what's being done is exploring the possibilities for working in all sorts of supported ways. You see our vision on the public transportation of the future, where you're hanging out and moving without being seated in public transport. So to bring it back to the skilled intentionality framework, in such a process, there's a coordination with multiple relevant affordances that are basically already, to a large extent, available there, but coordinated in different ways. And that then slowly, step by step, lead to this making of the art installation. Now, another type of research that we do at the University of Amsterdam is look at patients with deep brain stimulation. This is done at the Academic Medical Center, and there's a certain group of patients which get electrodes in their brain being stimulated in the nucleus accumbens by a system that's similar to a pacemaker. So here there's a battery, and there's an electric impulse that basically stimulates frequently these patients, and these are either severely depressed patients or patients with obsessive compulsive behavior. And what is interesting there is that the landscape of affordances, as I already showed with the depressed patients, the landscape of affordances doesn't change so much. But when this stimulation works, the entire field of affordances can change within seconds. You see Damian Denise, with who I collaborate, and other collaborators are Maarten van Westen and Sanneke de Haan. And here you see him pointing out where the electrode would be going into the skull. And I want to show you some of the things the patients with obsessive compulsive behavior say about this experience of having obsessive compulsive behavior and how the world changes when the stimulation of the brain stimulation is switched on. So one of the patients reported, "I'm back again, I can feel myself again. I can feel the ground, the colors are brighter, before there was just fear, and now I'm back again." So within seconds, when the stimulation is switched on, and these are patients who have been treated in psychiatry sometimes for decades, basically what happens is that they get a grip on their environment again. Another example, when the deep brain stimulation was turned on, that was very strange. I had a pleasant feeling all of a sudden. Right before I had been quite negative, and then 2 minutes later I was thriving. Before I saw all the restrictions, you know, from having this disorder, all the things I cannot do. But after the deep brain stimulation, I thought, oh, I can do this. So what you see happening is that the stimulation in a particular part of the brain, the nucleus accumbens, basically changes how people experience the action possibilities that are there available in the environment. They are differently solicited by the affordances available. Final example, again, someone with obsessive compulsive behavior. And I should tell that often they are afraid for a bacteria and they don't want to pick up phones, at least this patient. And this patient reports, "I found myself picking up the phone and even saying yes to an invitation, just like that. After I hung up, I thought, what have I done? But then I thought, so what?" So basically this stimulation changes their entire engagement with the world, and it changes the field of relevant affordances within seconds. In the case of depression, from such a field to such a structured field, and from OCD, from a field where something first needs to be done, say cleaning, to a more normally structured field where multiple action possibilities are engaged with at the same time. So what we see in obsessive compulsive behavior is that deep brain stimulation rapidly changes many aspects of the engagement of the patient with the world. The social interactions they have, the way they reflect, on the situation, their mood, including the anxiety, which is one of the main issues, interest, perception. So it's an entire global change that happens within seconds. It changes, as phenomenologists would say, the entire way of being in the world within seconds. And a way to make it more concrete is to say that it changes the selective responsiveness to the field of relevant affordances as a whole. So not just to one affordance, but there's a renewed openness to the action possibilities available. Now, relating this again to the skilled intentionality framework, you can see a skilled intentionality as having an action readiness to engage with the relevant affordances in the situation. And the skilled intentionality framework for embodied cognitive science as basically showing how various levels of analysis can be connected. And these levels of analysis are then the ecological, psychological level that describes this landscape of available affordances, phenomenology that describes how we experience the solicitation of the affordances, and biology and neuroscience, and particularly neurodynamics, that are relevant if you want to understand, for instance, the impact of deep brain stimulation. You could say that the brain and the body anticipate which affordances to act on next. And that relevant affordances, and this is quite crucial for if you try to explain what's going on, that relevant affordance-related patterns of action readiness are crucial for understanding what happens at the bodily level, are crucial for explanatory reasons. So the selective openness to relevant affordances, I like to give the example of the hungry rabbit. When it's hungry, it's of course selectively open to detecting food. And then food can be effectively alluring and bodily potentiating, getting the animal ready to respond to these affordances of eating the carrot. In the case of architecture, if they are working on a project and there's some problem, if they are discontented, then they will see possibilities for resolving that dissatisfaction. But what they also do is to take the concerns, and this is an observation that came from ethnographic research, that the architects, when they are working, they take the concerns of a collaborator who may not be physically present also into consideration when evaluating options. So this collaborator who lives in a different city in the Netherlands and sometimes isn't present when the design process is made further, what he cares about is taking into consideration in the when they are basically changing and exploring the action possibilities of making an art installation. In this case, it's a different art installation. It's this mobile object that's basically a sculpture that's that allows you to explore a vacant airbase while working on brainstorm-like sessions, for instance. Here you see it in progress. You see the size of it. And the reason that I'm showing it is that the ethnography that we did on the process of making the art installation basically showed that the architects are simultaneously responsive to multiple affordances that are there available. They've even structured their entire surroundings with a model there and collaborated there, the drawings, the phone, all the action possibilities are present up to the cup of coffee that the Ford's drinking from. And they have a selective openness to the relevant affordances in the particular situation. And when there is a discontent or a tension or a dissatisfaction, that changes the selective openness to pick up what is relevant, and that may be the phone, to make a phone call to solve a certain problem, say. So again, what this shows is that if there's a tension or a discontent, that changes the tendency towards grip on the affordances available, which in turn, the relevant affordances drive the states of action readiness at the bodily level. And this is at a micro level, and self-organization then makes it the case that there is a macro level pattern for responding to this field, which then changes the world So it's an entire loop that continuously changes the relationship to the world. Now, a question one may have is, how can relevant affordances drive action in this agent environment system? And typically philosophers tend to think of intentions in the head that then put the body in action. But what we have here is a different way of looking at the genesis of action. It's basically relevant affordances that drive action when someone is skilled. So here's a skilled boxer in action, playing with the heavy bag, training on it. The heavy bag offers possibilities for doing jabs, uppercuts, and hooks. And the boxer, because he has skills, is ready for all these affordances offered by the heavy bag, and turns towards an optimal distance from the heavy bag to do all the different punches. So to a position, if this is the heavy bag, where the boxer is able to do the hook, the jab, and the uppercut. Research in human movement sciences show that that is 0.6 of the arm's length. But more importantly, is thinking in terms of moving towards a zone where you're ready for doing, where you are ready for responding to the different relevant affordances that the heavy bag or the situation can offer. So there's an optimal metastable zone, as it's called, where you can be ready for the different possibilities in the situation. And while acting on one affordance, a skilled body is already simultaneously preparing for the other action possibilities as well. There's a kind of anticipation going on. So the heavy bag, for the skilled boxer, generates multiple relevant affordance related states of action readiness related to the jab, the hook, and the uppercut. And then boxers tend to this metastable zone where rapid switching between multiple affordance, rapid switching between multiple states of action readiness is possible, so that the boxing bag basically can invite the punch that's being made. The boxer doesn't need to decide. The boxer just needs to be in this metastable zone where the boxing bag is triggering which action occurs. And given that he's skilled and prepared for all of it, it works in this kind of situation. Now, it's of course important that there's multiple states of action readiness that self-organize and together generate this tendency towards an optimal grip on the field of affordances. So what we've suggested is that this way of thinking in terms of an optimal metastable zone where you're ready for the different relevant affordances in the situation is a notion that comes from the research on boxing, but would be relevant also for understanding all other forms of skilled action. And basically, having such a concept and thinking in terms of one skilled intentionality framework makes it possible to have concept bridging between different fields, because they are all forms of skilled action. So the skilled intentionality framework is, one of the things it does is offering a conceptual framework that allows to bridge between different fields that study skilled action. So the philosophical conclusions, skilled intentionality is coordinating with multiple affordances simultaneously. The context of the rich landscape of affordances in the human ecological niche is what makes collaboration possible. And what individuals bring to a collaboration, say, is their abilities and their care for having a grip on the situation. And what they do is being selectively open to the relevant action possibilities, and those are multiple at the same time. Now, what I want to do before finishing is showing you a movie that has to do with urgent societal issues, also by Raaf. So once we know that, that changing the environment can make a difference for dealing with urgent societal issues, say, need for housing, need for food, need for more sustainable behavior, segregation, that's been an issue ever since Brexit and Trump's election occurred. I think that it's important for philosophers and actually for everyone to think about how behavioral change can be generated. And one of the ways we can do that is by thinking in terms of radically changing the affordances available in our surroundings, just like we did with the end of sitting. But how could it be for social cohesion and for dealing with this problem of people being segregated? And I want to go quickly there. Basically, what we are proposing is a project called Trusted Strangers for the Port of Amsterdam, where there's enough space to do all sorts of new initiatives, particularly when Amsterdam exists 750 years in 2025. In a place where huge ships used to be built in the past, we want to make all sorts of social affordances for people from different subcultures, for people who normally wouldn't meet each other. It could be this kind of people, or people from this subculture, or people from this subculture. It doesn't matter so much. Here's another one. These are the city builders of Amsterdam. What we want to do is to basically create a landscape of social affordances in order to try to deal with this problem that people isolate themselves from each other, and that there's, for instance, a big gap between higher and lower educated people. And segregated is a global problem that basically only being increased by the internet and what they call the filter bubble. So can we turn strangers into trusted familiar strangers by increasing the possibilities for them to see each other and encounter each other? So here are strangers, and can, for instance, a social affordance as a campfire increase the possibility that strangers become trusted familiar strangers? Now what you will see is a floating park composed of these large barges of 100 meters that create microclimates, and basically it's a floating park on the River Eye that has this ambition to be realized in 2025. And I switch now to the movie, which lasts 5 minutes.
One major question for cities in the 21st century is, how do we invite people from different socio-cultural backgrounds to meet? How can strangers become trusted, familiar strangers? On Amsterdam's Eye River, a fleet of 24 barges is docked. These 100-meter-long steel barges provide a sheltered base for the floating New Amsterdam Park. Highly unexpected encounters occur, interactions between people who would never usually meet. Children playing in the petting zoo meet goths from the dark barge moored alongside. 12 barges accommodate a diversity of subcultures. The other 12 provide landscapes of social affordances, opportunities for social interaction. The park creates numerous chances to view strangers from a distance. Strangers become trusted, familiar strangers. The fire barge provides many sparks of social togetherness. Some of Amsterdam's most notorious figures keep the fire burning, while visitors share the comfort of the flames. Amateur botanists observing plants in the jungle Magistra barge are themselves being observed by people in boats floating by. Observing and being observed by the other is essential to the culture of the park. The New Amsterdam Park demonstrates how one person can take part in multiple subcultures. A botanist can also be a musician at the Classics barge, as well as a member of the Leather Garden. One of the social opportunities of the Grass Hill barge is sharing the experience of a sunset above the cranes in the port of Amsterdam. Grass Hill acts as a canvas where the city gathers in all of its diversity. The park, floating on the water, offers the city a space to breathe in. People feel free to express, celebrate, and share their identities. The spatial structure creates microclimates that are highly suitable for a wide range of atmospheres, meetings, and exhibitions, such as the Riverside Gallery and Panna Soccer Barge. The park is not just an invitation to enjoy the surroundings, but gives a shared responsibility to people from numerous socio-cultural groups. It brings a new kind of engagement to the public domain. One of the key aspects of the New Amsterdam Park is that all spaces are to be freely accessible. The layout of the park ensures that visitors can roam freely. People meet in the Moroccan mint tea garden, or suddenly become voyeurs watching Harry on Heel's leather garden through small portholes. The elevated footpaths enable visitors to explore the different subcultures below. Instead of straightforward pathways, hundreds of small passages and shortcuts lead through the park. It's a labyrinth of surprises. Sand is a compelling social gift where children and parents from different subcultures can meet. Social opportunities will change with the seasons. While summer encourages the young to jump from the barges into the water, winter brings ice skating or a hot spring barge. Unlike the high quays of the Amsterdam canals, the barges let people get close to the water, dipping their feet into it while thinking great thoughts. The low quays make it easy for visitors to fish, swim, or dock a boat. The omnipresence of the water's reflection, the Dutch light, deepens the experience of this unique park. The giant steel barges are a haven for bold experiments and artistic innovation. In the Robodock barge, people with different backgrounds gather to create a gripping world of arts, robotics, and fire. The New Amsterdam Park allows its visitors to experience the results of new, unconventional collaborations in their own city. Sitting in their boats, people catch sight of numerous worlds created here. Temporary programs can last for just one night or 1 month, or several years. The many visitors who come to see Holland's most famous flower are unexpectedly confronted with countless other worlds that Amsterdam has to offer. Less famous, perhaps, but certainly no less interesting or alluring. After walking through the lushness of the tulip fields, visitors may pass the obscure world of robotics and pyrotechnology. In the New Amsterdam Park, life is not predictable. The barges can be uncoupled regularly and rearranged within the grid to make new combinations of social subcultures close to each other. How, in the 21st century, do we unite people who become more and more estranged from each other? How do we turn them into trusted, familiar strangers? The park affords countless short and spontaneous interactions that connect people from diverse socio-cultural groups. Trusted Strangers presents a real-life thinking model for the future public domain of cities all over the world.
Okay, thank you for your attention.
Questions?
Thank you for your talk, Eric. I was thinking on your concept of, the concept of optimal metastable zone. And, well, in the way that it's presented regarding the boxing example, it seems to me like that it's very related to a spatial, also with the going to, like, seeing closer some art or a poster So it seems to me like it's still very related to a spatial, spatial, like in space. So how will be an optimal metastable zone in the case, for example, of reflecting about something, or like thinking?
So the metaphors to explain it are typically spatial. Even in mathematics, they have this notion of a phase space. But I think what matters is that we think in terms of all the relevant affordances for a person at a particular time, which can include those to reflect, but can also include those to get coffee. It's there all at the same time, typically when you're situated somewhere. Together, these multiple states of action readiness and the interaction between them sets up this metastable situation in which you're ready to respond to multiple relevant affordances offered by your surroundings. And not just limited to your present surroundings, but offered by the ecological niche in which you are situated, but selectively, to which you are selectively open. So it's far more an abstract concept than it may seem here with the examples of the boxing and, for instance, that's just because the research that was done in boxing. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. Just as a challenge to ourselves, I was surprised of how powerful the effect of the deep brain stimulation was, right? I mean, it's like a complete switch, and suddenly everything becomes a solicitation again. And yet, all they were doing is stimulating the brain, right? So it's almost like that begs the question against us who are trying to sell a story that involves the body, the environment, relationships, interactions. If at the end what the psychiatrist just has to do is stick a needle in your brain and turn on the voltage, right? I mean, it's just a little bit, I mean, it doesn't explain affordances perhaps, but at least at the level of relevance, like, you know, what you call solicitations, it seems then that maybe a purely brain-based story is only what we need.
Yeah. I'm glad you asked this question, because I didn't tell something that's quite crucial for understanding how deep brain stimulation works. So the stimulation is switched on, and then there's thousands of parameter settings that psychiatrists have, and they need to work through the settings to find an optimal setting. And in this process, they basically ask the patient, how does it feel? So there you have already something that's coming from the patient, namely the input in this therapeutic situation where the patient is also collaborating. But moreover, and perhaps more important even, the deep brain stimulation gets the patient in a state where the typical problems of being, for instance, in an obsessive-compulsive state, of being very anxious or being very hyper-reflexive, those are gone, but there's still a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy needed in order for the patient to be able to function normally in society, because the compulsions, they are so strong that they tend to keep on doing them even after the deep brain stimulation. So the deep brain stimulation basically makes it possible for the patient to get the cognitive behavioral therapy or any other form of psychotherapy that's necessary to help them to recover. So, and we see it basically as just basically changing the dynamics of this entire brain-body environment system. So by stimulating in the nucleus accumbens, you indeed change the dynamics of this entire system. And I think you can describe it in terms from the patient, the dynamics becoming such that the patient is able to get again in this optimal metastable zone where they are able to be selectively open to multiple affordances simultaneously and not just drawn to, say, cleaning all the time. Yeah.
Thanks for your presentation. And I was just thinking about it, that you are transforming the space, right? With this kind of architectural landscapes, that are going to afford this social interaction. But I am thinking not in this material architectonic thing. For example, do you have some kind of example of how can you afford this social interaction, not in a material world, not just in the social interaction per se, like some kind of habits or some kind of social dynamics, or because you show a problem, and we have a problem, this discrimination, this. So I was wondering if you have some kind of idea of create these landscapes of affordance, but not so in a material way, instead in a social interaction way, if you have some kind of idea.
Yeah. I think it's often very difficult. So one of the approaches that we have is we try to think in terms of the environment as being not material, not social, but socio-material, because the social and the material, they are so intertwined that taking them apart in our human form of life doesn't make much sense. Now you seem to be asking me for something that would be purely social, and I'm not sure if that exists, because even speech, for instance, has a material component. I hesitate answering that or wanting to go in that direction, just focusing on the social. But of course, one of the ideas behind the entire Trusted Strangers project, a trusted stranger, the phenomenon is a bit similar to when you would be going to New York, and there you encounter someone from your own street who here in Mexico City you would normally not say hello to or engage with, and then but because you're there in this different context in New York City, you notice that this stranger actually is a trusted familiar stranger just because you have been spending so much time in the same areas together. But again, there is still this setting was your street, say, or waiting for the same tram. So also there you cannot even take the social apart from the waiting for the same bus or the same tram, I think.
Yeah, there are too many points. I like to react, and as I was very stimulated by your talk. Thank you. But I would just stick to the last part, the film, when you talk about trust. I mean, I love the idea, and much as I like the project, I wonder to what extent can real trust be generated thereby. I mean, I understand, again, the idea, but in my opinion, trust is something that somehow, I mean, you can be sort of helped, into developing it because of the circumstances and the material setting that you are providing there. I think it's a clear example. But if we don't want a Disneyland kind of effect to happen, it has to be real in order for it to last and for people to feel comfortable. So since you are, I mean, I was wondering to what extent it could be a long-lasting effect, that trust, that people would feel and generate there, how to measure it, and I mean, because I think there are no shortcuts basically for trust. I mean, you have to put it to work and put have to be proved somehow, put to work and in real life situations. So on the one hand, I'm sort of skeptical, about how far you could go down the road, and on the other hand, I love the project, and I would even like to add, why not have sort of undercover hostesses, that mingle, with the public, and they take the initiative, to go, after the people and just try to be casual, like they could be actors, trained actors, and just spend the whole day, just talking with people, and that would generate, people. And so it's sort of artificial in a sense, but then once you get going, it's primed up, the system is primed up, and probably just go on their own in real terms.
Yeah, so these are this is a question and a suggestion. To start with the suggestion, so also with the end of sitting, we often have people who are there in the new space because it's so new that people typically don't know what to do. So it's good to help them a bit. And even at the end of sitting, we had our people, a few of our people always being present and showing how it could be used, and also taking people more or less literally by the hand to explore new parts of the space. And the same could indeed work in the Trusted Strangers or New Amsterdam Park project. Then you asked if, will this really generate trust? So the kind of trust we're talking about is what Wittgenstein would call basic trust. So it's a very deep kind of basic non-cognitive trust, but it's a kind of trust that you see being in place when you are in New York and then encounter your neighbor who you never been speaking to. So that kind of feeling, so very just feeling of being at ease and connected with the person. But to know if it works or not works, we would say, just like with the end of sitting, just make it and then have empirical scientists do their experiments and then you know it. If you don't try it, you won't know it. So, and we like to make it as an art project, and then the science can step in and observe what they like to observe. It's open for everyone, including scientists. Yeah.
Any more questions?
Thank you. I'm wondering whether I'm sure your framework has implications on education. So education in all levels. And I guess that there is a different way of thinking how we educate people in this framework. Could you maybe tell us a bit about it?
Yes, I can tell how we have used it. So my brother and I have set up a master program at one of the art academies in Amsterdam. And there what we did was have our students engage in different practices than their own. So they were basically being taught to become specialists in temporary reuse of vacant buildings. I didn't explain that project, but it's the project we did at the Venice Biennale in 2010. So there's many vacant buildings in the Netherlands, 10,000. And many of them are amazing, vacant monuments, empty monuments. How could we basically use these resources better? And after the Venice Biennale, we set up a master's program to educate architects, artists, lawyers, all sorts of people to become specialists in vacancy studies. And one of the things they did in this process, in this program, was explore all sorts of different fields that would not directly have a connection. Say a location scout, some went to work with a location scout for movies. Another went to work with someone who specialized in making bikes for handicapped people, because it turned out to be crucial for reusing vacant buildings. It's important to be able to move from one vacant building to another vacant building relatively quickly. So then it's important to know how to get people moving quickly. So they went to work with a moving company one, and another with a bicycle maker. So basically that's it. Engage in different practices and look and learn the skills they have, and then basically import these skills into your own practice. I think that's really one of the things that follow from it, because then when you import that skills into your own environment, then you will notice relevant affordances for what you are interested in, using the skills that you've acquired in that other practice.
Okay, but I was also thinking about the last part of your talk about the values and these very important problems we have to face, like discrimination, not only with other cultures, but within our culture, these class discriminations and this, this sexism, and whether there is a way of educating that, not only with these interventions, which I think could be long-lasting if done well, but also right from the start.
So I can only answer very generally, which may not be very satisfying, but in order to be able to pick up on affordances, you need to have skills. So education teaching people skills is crucial always. Otherwise, you are not able to pick up the affordances that are there. Those skills are the complement of the available affordances. So, in that sense, education, or as Gibsonians would call it, education of the attention, because you point them to the affordances that are already there, is crucial. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks so much for
Thanks
the
for your
talk.
attention.
Thank you all. And we're having the cocktail.